I'm joined today by freshman U.S. House Representative for District 32, Colin Allred. So thank you for joining us. What's life been like since winning the election?
Well, thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here at Richland, not far from where I grew up. Today is my second day in Congress that has not been during a shutdown. So that's been interesting. I was sworn in, I think, 10 days into the shutdown, and of course that has kind of dominated our first few weeks. But I think I've been encouraged by a lot of the things that are actually happening in Congress. My first day, I introduced a resolution to protect the ACA, and that passed with bipartisan support. And I was really pleased about that, and I've enjoyed getting to know some of my new colleagues, especially I didn't know as many from the Republican side from before as I do now, and I'm encouraged by the folks who came to Congress in this session. I think a lot of them are there for the right reasons, and I think that they'll be great leaders for our country.
All right, thank you. So Congressman Allred will be answering questions from our panel of Richland Student Government members and Student Media reporters. So Haya, can you please get us started?
Thank you. My name is Haya Kazi. I'm the president of Student Government Association here at Richland College. My question for you is, this is your third career at only 35. So what inspired you to run for office?
Well, thank you, Haya, and it's good to see you. I think that I was a civil rights lawyer before I ran for office, and so I saw this as an extension of that work. I was interested in voting rights and making sure that no matter who you were, that you were able to cast your ballot. And I worked in the Obama administration and worked at the Department of Housing and Urban Development, trying to make sure that folks had a roof over their head. And as I said, I'm not just running. I didn't just run anywhere. I ran in my hometown, where I was born and raised. I have a deep connection here, and I thought that we could do better. And I tried to run a campaign that I thought was consistent with our values here in North Texas, and I've tried to keep that going in office. And so, I think that public service is a noble thing, and that we should encourage people to get into public service. And shouldn't only be the province of people who are, a certain number of decades old. We need to have fresh ideas and new blood, just like any institution does.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, Congressman. My name is Edward Cisse. I'm the Vice President of Student Government Association. My question is to you, as a freshman congressman, what was your biggest surprise and disappointment while taking office during the government shutdown?
Well, thank you. I know we spoke earlier, and I know you went to my high school,
Yes,
so
sir.
Good to be talking to a Hillcrest grad. Go Panthers. Biggest surprise and biggest disappointment of the shutdown, is that what the question is?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good question. I think you would probably say you might be surprised at how close the positions were of the two parties during most of the shutdown. Most people that I talked to, this was not a huge divide here. It was something that the policy differences were fairly minor within the Congress. The issue here was largely with the White House and with the Senate. And so the House of Representatives, and at least in my discussions with my colleagues, we really weren't that far apart. And I think that was surprising. It's also kind of disappointing when you realize that a gap that small led to the longest shutdown in U.S. history. And of course, I think that probably also be the disappointment, that this lasted as long as it did, and that the kind of intransigence that we saw. I voted, I think, 10 or maybe 11 times to reopen the government, always at levels of funding that had previously been voted on by the Republican majority in the Senate, that they had voted on 92-7 just a few months earlier. This is something that was not controversial. Some of our Texas senators, John Cornyn, voted for those spending levels. And then, a few weeks later, with a new class of folks coming in with a new Democratic majority in the House, now all of a sudden this is the time that you're going to dig in your heels and say, I got to have my way. And I'll say this, I do think that the era of shutdown as policy lever is over.
Right.
Because I think that people have seen how unpopular it is, how it's not what the American people want. And, our constitutional structure doesn't say that if you don't get your way, you get to shut down the government. We have separate branches of government. They're required, basically, to work together to get things done. And so I think that what we're going to see coming out of this, hopefully, is that this is the end of shutdown as kind of I'm going to take my ball and go home way of governing. So,
Right. Thank you, sir.
I'm Kaylin Bradley. I'm the online editor for the Richland Chronicle, and I'm also a senator of student government here.
Awesome.
The nation has been embroiled in the conflict over building a wall on the southern border of Texas. What's your position on the wall, and would you favor a technological or physical barrier if you were given the choice?
Well, I think we have to be very careful what we mean when we say the wall or a wall, because we had about a 4-year period in which President Trump was going around saying we're going to build a 30-foot high wall and it's going to be from sea to shining sea, and that clearly is not going to happen. What is true is that we already have 650 miles or so of fencing along our southern border, and those were put in place by bipartisan efforts with votes from people who I serve with now who are Democrats under President Bush. And so I do think that in places, physical barriers are sometimes appropriate because it allows you to funnel traffic into certain areas where you can have your responsible checks of what's going on. But I don't think that it should be the policy of the United States that what we're going to do in terms of securing our borders is just use a medieval piece of technology, right? We are in 2019. We have technology to do a lot of amazing things, and we can do things that are much more effective than the same technology that we had in the first century, right? And so I think we have to be smart about this. For example, 90% of the heroin that comes into our country doesn't come in through the southern border, it comes in through our ports of entry. The vast majority of drugs that enter our country enter through our ports of entry, and that includes airports, seaports. It's unfortunately true that we have such a large flow of drugs into our country that you literally couldn't bring it across the southern border on foot or in a car or something like that. It's much too large of a business, actually, unfortunately. And so if we're really serious about securing our border, and I'll also add that the Coast Guard has said they can only interdict about 25% of the contraband that they are aware of because they don't have the capacity to catch other folks. So if we're really serious about that, then let's fund the things that are smart, right? And I think that there is a bipartisan majority that's willing to do that. What we have to have is reasonable people at each level of government, on the Senate side and the White House, who, if they're serious about this, will work with us on it. And I think that that's what these next 30 days are going to be about.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, those are some great comments. So Richland College has a large number of students affected by the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, aka DACA.
Right.
So are you in favor of a pathway to citizenship for Dreamers?
Absolutely. I think we should pass the DREAM Act, and I said that during the campaign, and that would include, I think it should be a clean DREAM Act. I don't think it should be used as a piece of leverage for something that I don't think we need. As I said, I think we already have a majority of folks who are willing to make the right investments in actual border security. But our Dreamers, it's a separate issue to me, and I think it's almost, it shouldn't be tied into the border because these are folks who we made a promise to. We've said, especially for those who have applied for DACA status, you come out of the shadows, we will protect you, we will try and integrate you into our country. I've met many Dreamers. I had a Dreamer worked on my campaign. I believe they're every bit as American as I am, and I believe that we should find a way to welcome them to our country. And we have to have a comprehensive immigration reform that addresses the 11 million or so folks who are undocumented, who are here, who are not committing crimes, who are contributing to our economy, and who I think we need to find a way to give them a pathway to become citizens. And it's going to involve a lot of back and forth on what that pathway involves and the steps that go along with it. But that's okay. That's part of the normal process, but we need to do that. We also need to fix our legal immigration system to make it easier for folks who we want to be able to come here to become a part of this American experiment.
And one more. Should any of this related to DACA and mainly what we're talking about, should that be part of any conversation regarding the funding for the border wall?
Well, I'm never going to say that I don't want to take anything off the table in terms of negotiations because that's the whole point. You enter negotiations and you try to get them done. I've said that I don't think that it should be tied to that because I think that it's a separate issue. I think it's a commitment we've already made. And I think that it's, in my opinion, a moral issue for our country. Are we going to take kids who've never known a country other than ours and try to send them somewhere else? Or are we going to try and find a reasonable way to deal with this? So I do think they're separate issues, but I also recognize that in a negotiation, sometimes you're going to have to compromise and do things that you maybe wouldn't do in a perfect scenario. So, I'm coming into this willing to negotiate. I think a lot of my colleagues are as well, especially those of us who are new. We don't have some of the scar tissue of some of the folks who've been involved in these battles for years and years and years. My main concern is to make sure that we do take care of our dreamers and make sure that we can remove that kind of shadow that's been hanging over this. And I will see how that happens, but I think we need to get it done.
Perfect. Thank you.
Hi, Congressman Allred. My name is Tan Kong, and I'm Treasurer of Student Government. I have a question for you. So you were hesitant go on the record from the election of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. Is she meeting your expectation?
Well, I wouldn't say I was hesitant. I said that I wanted to see who was running, and I wanted to sit down with them and talk to them about what their plans were. And, it's an important thing. And, I think you need to recognize that your vote in Congress is your leverage on whatever the issue is, whether it's for a bill, whether it's for the speaker's vote. That's your leverage. And what you need to do with that is leverage that to take care of your district that you're representing, right? And so I used my vote for speaker to leverage the best things I could for my district. And so I made clear what my priorities were on infrastructure, on healthcare, on the things that I wanted to be working on. And as you saw on day one, I was the leader of this resolution to protect the ACA and pass in a bipartisan fashion. I'm on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. I'm going to be working on those issues. So that's the way this works, and I think that's the way it's supposed to work. In the end, of course, on the Democratic side, there was no one else running for speaker, but I still wanted to have that conversation and to make sure that our values as North Texans are being represented. It's not a personality thing. It's not a it's not like you might see in the papers where it's like, are you for or against? It's what I'm trying to do is get the best for North Texas, right? In every single scenario and on every single vote, and that's what I did there as well.
Right, thank you.
Yeah.
Hello, I'm Trace Miller. I'm the Assistant Managing Editor for the Richland Chronicle. President Trump recently rescinded an Obama-era policy regarding transgender individuals in the military. What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, well, I've been very clear about this. I think that it's the only thing we should be saying to folks who are transgender who are serving in our military is thank you for your service. That's the only thing we should be saying to them. We shouldn't be trying to treat them any differently. We shouldn't be trying to harass them, certainly. And I think that this policy is misguided and it's discriminatory, and it's one that I think should have never been brought to the fore. And that's not just my opinion. The Department of Defense was managing the situation just fine before it became a political issue. There was no outcry. There was no statement that this was affecting our readiness to do our jobs in the military or anything like that. I think it's being used as a political wedge issue to try and say, whose side are you on, and try to divide Americans and use a hot button issue to try and gin up some support for something. And I think that's always the wrong thing. When your decision making is driven by trying to get the politics of the moment or to heat up your base or to whoever it might be, it's almost always true that's also the wrong policy for the country, right? In my opinion, your decision making should be driven by what's best for the country. What does the country need? Was there any need to make a change in this policy for the Department of Defense? Absolutely not. And in fact, when you saw this first implemented almost by tweet by the president, the Department of Defense said, we haven't received an order, we're not going to change anything, we don't have a problem. It required some further steps to try and say we want this to be done. And so now what are our transgender folks who are serving our military? What position does this put them in? What does it tell them about how we appreciate or don't appreciate their service to our country? Some of them are serving in war zones and are protecting our freedoms. I don't think this is how we should be treating them.
Alrighty, so moving right along. The definition of domestic violence was recently changed on the Department of Justice website without explanation. The current version indicates that a felony or misdemeanor act of physical violence must be committed by a current or former spouse in order to reinforce the law, eliminating emotional or psychological abuse. What are your thoughts on the change in policy?
Well, that's, I'd have to take a closer look at what went into that change. I think that in general, the Violence Against Women Act should have never been allowed to be in danger of its funding expiring, which we saw recently happen. This should always be a bipartisan bill. There should always be no question about whether or not it's going to be renewed. And I was extremely disappointed by that. I don't think we should be playing political games with that. In my experience, from what I've seen, I think that the most effective thing we can do to combat domestic violence at the local level with federal support is to fund the shelters that are doing the work on the ground and that can identify what's happening and that can provide a safe place for women and for members of families who are trying to get away from the scenarios that they're in, whether that be emotional or physical abuse. And what we saw in this last shutdown is that many of the shelters across the country were very close to running out of funding entirely, and were worried about how they were going to offer those services. That should never, ever be the case.
Okay, thank you.
I have a foreign policy question. The turmoil in Venezuela has been all over the news recently. What's your take on the conflict, and do you support the president's actions in endorsing the opposition? Also, what are your feelings on China's and Russia's reactions to the conflict and to the U.S. endorsement?
Yeah, well, it's a complicated situation. It is, but what we've seen is that Venezuela is on the brink, and with inflation at incredibly historic levels, with the people of Venezuela not getting, I think, the service that they deserve from their government. The social contract has broken down there. And they had a sham election in which, most of the countries around the world who recognize elections saw that this wasn't an actual election. There wasn't a real vote happening here. And so I do support recognizing the challenger here. I think that it's time for the Maduro government to end. I think the international community that is interested in democracy and the expansion of democracy, whether that's the US, UK, France, we are all united on this. And I think that we should be doing everything we can, especially in our hemisphere and in our region, to advance democracy and to try and make sure the Venezuelan people are getting the service that they need. 3 million Venezuelans have fled that country and are pouring into their surrounding neighbors because of the turmoil at home. This is something that will affect us and does affect us, and we should be doing everything we can to help our own hemisphere out as much as possible. Now, when you see governments that are more repressive and that don't have the same, I think, approach to democracy as we do, lining up, I think it's very clear what's happening here. And I think that we need to do everything we can to bring international pressure and financial pressure to bring about the change we need. We are Venezuela's largest customer for their oil, which is the largest part of their economy that they export. We have a lot of leverage here, and we need to use it.
Thank you so much.
Okay. While we're on foreign affairs, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia has been accused of the heinous crime of torturing and murdering Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi. The United States has not taken action against the Saudi prince, but more should have been done to ensure the safety of U.S. journalists and citizens abroad.
Yeah. Well, this was a disaster. It was very, very poorly handled by the White House and by this administration. And going back to the Venezuela question, we have to lead in the direction that we want to see the world to follow. And when we allow things like this to happen, the standard is lowered across the world. When you can kidnap an American journalist who was here, writing for the Washington Post, who's a permanent resident here in the United States, and the grisly part of the murder aside, when you can do that and kill that person because of what they are saying about your government without repercussion or without consequence, that sends a message to the rest of the world that you can do that in another area. And I had a coach used to say, when you lower the standard of what you expect, that's where the new standard becomes. And when we allow international actors, whether they are allies or not, to do the wrong thing, now the entire world's standard is lowered because we are that irreplaceable nation, and that we have to lead in these areas. And so it was extremely disappointing. And I think that we need to really be analyzing and looking at our entire relationship with Saudi Arabia and how we're handling that. We've seen so many times in the past that just because you are the enemy of our enemy doesn't mean that you're our friend, right? And it doesn't mean that we should allow every single thing to happen. And we've seen that in the Cold War context. We've seen that in other contexts as well. We should be better than that. We should be setting a standard and holding our allies to that standard. And when they don't meet it, there should be serious, serious consequences.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, thank you. I have a domestic policy question. So, on Friday, as you know, Friday morning, Roger Stone, longtime advisor to President Trump, was arrested and indicted for crimes related to Russian hack emails. As the Mueller investigation moves forward, what is your opinion on the decision of moving to impeachment proceedings?
So this is about Roger Stone or about impeachment?
I guess both.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think that in general, what we've seen from the number of indictments and guilty pleas and prison sentences that have been meted out is that the Trump campaign was in very close contact with Russia and with Russian actors who were trying to influence our election. Right? That is now beyond doubt. The Trump campaign manager, Paul Manafort, is going to be serving time probably for the rest of his life because of those contacts. And Roger Stone was contacting and working with a Russian cutout for their intelligence service that was part of an attack on Americans. And by that I mean the hack of the DNC. Because anytime you are using cyber capabilities to attack an American, it is an attack on all of us, even if it's just one party, right? And it wasn't in this case. We know that they also hacked the Republican Party, but that's not the point. The point is that we need to be united on this, regardless of party. An attack on us, on one of us, is an attack on all of us. And this is unprecedented for us as a country, in which we'd have a major campaign willing to work with a foreign adversary or even with any foreign entity to try and influence one of our elections. And we all, as Americans, regardless of party, need to be very worried about that. Americans and Americans only should be choosing our leadership. There are a lot of entities around the world that would love to influence our policy and our elections. And if we let this go, this will become the new standard, that you can influence our elections, you can get involved in our elections, and there may be no consequences. So that is a huge problem for us. In terms of impeachment, I've been very clear on this for, I think, 2 years now. I'm not a fan of impeachment, and I take it very seriously. I think that it should only be used when it's done in a way that is unifying for the country, in a way that is obvious and that is in the right interest of the country. And where we are right now is that we have an investigation going on. It's being led by basically a legendary prosecutor who is a Republican, who served under Republican presidents, and who is step by step going through, identifying, indicting, and pursuing what happened in this election. And I think that we need to allow that investigation to reach its final ending point. In the meantime, we need to make sure that it is not influenced by any political considerations in the Department of Justice, that there's no pressure being put on it. But that's the right thing for the country, is to let that play out, see what the investigation results are, and then proceed in an orderly fashion, you know. I'm an attorney. I believe strongly in our constitutional values. I think that the impulse to kind of rush into the idea of impeachment is a political one. And as I said earlier, when a political impulse is driving your policy, it's usually going to be the wrong thing for the country, right? So what we need to do, if it does come to that, it should be bipartisan. You know, President Nixon resigned when his own party said that you have to go, and that what resulted in the end, a more positive outcome for the country. The impeachment of Bill Clinton on the reverse hand was entirely a political one-party thing, and it was very bad for the country. We don't want to repeat that. We should learn from our mistakes.
Thank you, sir.
So now I have a last question for you, and this question has divided the nation last week. So who do you think is going to win the Super Bowl?
Yeah. You know, obviously I played in the NFL, and I really didn't like the Patriots when I played against them. And I'm not going to say anything about cheating or, you know, filming of defensive coaches and their signals, which did happen, or using deflated footballs. I'm not going to say anything about that. I'm just going to say that, you know, go Rams.
So, thank you. That's all the time we have today. And thank you, Congressman Allred. Thank you for joining us today, and thanks to all of our panel, and thanks to our viewers. This program will be available to watch again in all its entirety at richlandstudentmedia.com. Thank you for joining us.